So President Cyril Ramaphosa is still on his state visit to the UK and Northern Ireland. Ramaphosa has called on Britain to invest in South Africa, including in the energy sector. Let's talk about his trip with Steve Grudz, the international relations expert. Good to have your time, sir, this afternoon. Has this visit been worth the trouble?
I think so. I think it's made for good television and an important opportunity to rekindle relations with one of our most important trading partners in the UK. There's a lot of political support and a lot of common interests, so I do think it's been a successful trip.
And a lot of time has been spent on the economy as well as issues of the environment, climate change. President Ramaphosa repeating what he said at the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh recently, that what needs to happen is that countries such as the UK, the developed nations, need to pour in more money, not loans, to help the developing world or Africa more broadly in order to better weather the storm of climate change. Are you satisfied with the commitments made by the UK?
So, in these things, the devil is in the detail, and we'll have to see whether these pledges are, in fact, honored and whether the money does come and that the money is well used on our side as well. I think that's important. I think there could be a bit more transparency in the way that this is being done, but there's no question that Ramaphosa has a consistent message from COP now to the state visit. Britain is seen as one of those countries more responsible for climate change and for industrialization. Africa only emits about 3 to 4% of the carbon into the atmosphere, and the older industrial countries are being asked to subsidize and pay for the more developing countries who are suffering the effects of climate change disproportionately.
And then on the economy then, I mean, one of the things that the President says is going to be looked at in his address last night is an agreement to allow more South Africans to go and study in the UK. Is that the best way to deal with that sort of thing? Because often when people study abroad, there's a concern that those who do study abroad seldom or sometimes do not want to come ply their trade here at work and would rather stay where they studied and further their careers there.
Yeah, I think it's always a risk, but it's possible to have contracts with those particular students. I think the UK has some of the top universities in the world, and if we can get more of our students there, all the better. I think we have to work on strategies as well to retain them and to bring them back, to bring their skills back to South Africa where we desperately need them. But the Chevening Scholarship, for example, for postgraduates has been extremely successful, has had some of the top minds of South Africa go to the UK and come back and help the society and the economy with their skills when they return.
Mm-hmm. And should then that education be education that's steered more towards entrepreneurship, for instance, because as far as jobs available, even the best graduates in this country at the moment are struggling?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think the scholarships they're talking about, or the places at universities, will cover a range of disciplines and subjects, from the arts to the sciences to commerce. So, in a skills-scarce country like ours, I think any training, any furthering of education can only be a positive thing.
And the other criticism of relationships between South Africa and other African countries and the West is, even when there's a great deal of trade going on, local businesses here still say what is difficult is getting a clear enough path for them to be able to establish themselves, perhaps even independently within the UK's business space. Is that happening enough?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I can even really answer that with any authority. So, but what I do think is that South Africans are entrepreneurial. They are finding a way to make a living, and if there are ways to make it easier to invest in the UK or to set up businesses in the UK, then I think the two governments should look at that.
And do you think there's space for cooperation between South Africa and the UK? I know there was discussion around the Commonwealth and its importance, relevance today in a post-colonial era. How should that relationship be structured when you consider the problems, for example, of the region where South Africa has also taken an important position in trying, for instance, along with the rest of SADC, to end an insurgency in northern Mozambique. There are other countries on the continent with a vast array of problems as well.
Yes, look, I think the Commonwealth is an institution that is struggling to to have its identity and its relevance in the modern world. It's a very interesting grouping of mostly former, but not exclusively, former British colonies. But we are seeing some of those former colonies in the Caribbean, for example, removing the king or queen as head of state, and we've seen that now from two countries. So that's one of the questions I think Britain will be quite concerned about. I mean, South Africa belongs to lots of clubs, the Commonwealth being one of them, the BRICS being another. I don't see too much energy going into the Commonwealth, but one of the issues that South Africa does want put on the table is the readmittance of Zimbabwe to the Commonwealth, and I think we will go into bat for Zimbabwe. But yeah, relations with Britain are long-standing, strong, and a visit like this can only cement them further.
And what would A, Zimbabwe benefit from readmission at this point, and B, what are the chances of its successful readmission if South Africa continues to lobby for that, when you consider that the country's political instability and accusations of a crackdown on dissent continue today, almost 20 years since the first signs of the violent turn in the country happened?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to answer your second question first, I'm not sure Zimbabwe actually fulfills the criteria of democracy and the rule of law in order to be readmitted. It's quite unusual for there to be this readmission process. South Africa, of course, left the Commonwealth in 1960 and was readmitted after 1994, but that was I think once we'd had our democratic transition, it was more of a formality. What would Zimbabwe gain? I think it would be part of its reintegration into the international system. It would show some legitimacy for the regime. It would be a big PR exercise for the Mnangagwa government, and would again be part of this club where it would be interacting with former colonies and with Britain. So I think there's quite a lot at stake, and I'm sure South Africa...
There is an irony there, Steve, is there not, where Zimbabwe, with all its faults and the faults of its government and horrific reports of rights violations and economy that's been in a downward spiral for more than 10 years, there is an irony that a former colonial power or a colonial structure would even lend any sort of legitimacy to a sovereign state.
Well, that's true. But these are the times that we live in. And I think that being able to say we were able to rejoin the Commonwealth will be a feather in the cap of Mnangagwa if it happens. I'm not so sure it would happen because, as you say, I think conditions in Zimbabwe have deteriorated and are deteriorating on a daily and monthly basis, and basic human rights are not being observed. I mean, that also asks questions about South Africa's foreign policy, where we say that human rights will be the backbone of what we are trying to achieve, yet maybe we're turning a blind eye to what's happening over the Limpopo.
Steve Grudz, grateful for your time today. Thank you, sir.